Hi everyone, let's start today talking about Chinese fortune cookies. By the way, these cookies have nothing to do with our historic cultural eating customs. Anyways, we've all eaten these delightful crispy snacks, and the most enjoyable part is when we crack open the cookie to get our fortune. So I came across this in my news feed this week, and it was a fortune cookie that was shared over social media. So let me show you. Fortune says, "You not have coronavirus. Just received my COVID-19 rapid test kit from China. So relieved. Thanks, Beijing." So what do you think? Kind of funny? Maybe not? It wasn't so funny for Anne-Marie after she shared it on her social media. And who is this Anne-Marie Trevelyan? Well, she's the British cabinet member for international development. Yeah, so a very public political figure. And after she had shared this meme, she was immediately called out by the opposition. She was demanded an apology for being crude, for being insensitive, and for even being racist. Now, I can see how some people could find this being insensitive and offensive, but it didn't affect me that strongly. So this little story led me to reflect this week. And oddly, this story started to make me think about questions and answers about faith. And it made me wonder. I wondered how my faith would be so much easier if God spoke to us in these little fortune cookies. So I thought, wouldn't it be so easy if God gave us notes like this? Imagine waking up each day and God's direction could be found simply cracking open a cookie and receiving your mission for the day. Clear, concise, and simple. Wouldn't you feel stronger when God gives you solid evidence of His will for your future? Well, this is actually the question that's being asked in our scripture this morning. Jesus, show us a sign. Give us some shock and awe. Let us see what you can do for us. When we hear and experience God's signs and wonders, they can really catalyze our faith, boost us up, and turn us towards God. Some of you have experienced some dramatic signs and answered prayers from God. However, this is not the typical path towards a life of deep faith. Asking for signs is really only a small part of our faith formation. And if we depend only on the shock and awe, well, we lose Christ. Signs and wonders is kind of like a shortcut. You know, after Jesus fed the 5,000, the people were awed. They wanted more. But look how Jesus responds to them. John 6:26. You were looking for me not because you saw a miraculous sign, but because you ate the loaves and you had your fill. In essence, he was saying, this is not about faith at all. You didn't even need a miracle. What you wanted was more food. So when we depend only on signs and on the physical things, we lose that trusting relationship with God. Because faith is built on obedience, on trust, and submission to Christ. So here's my main idea for this week. After God places that spark of faith into your heart, we must earnestly seek Him and pursue Him constantly, fanning that flame of faith to maturity. So there it is. So Jesus had been ministering and performing many miracles and healings. He was feeding the poor. But that's when He confronted with these religious bigwigs. And earlier they had accused Him of doing works by Satan's power. And they warned Him about doing something that was unpardonable. But Jesus was trying to teach them that He was the Messiah. But they weren't convinced, so they demanded a sign. Verse 38, Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you. Show us something. Do a miracle. Now this is a pretty simple and direct request, but Jesus again gives a curt answer. An evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. Pretty harsh. Basically, he says no. He rebukes them because of their stubborn hearts. So, is asking for signs such a bad thing? I think we've all done it. At some stage in our Christian life, and even right now, we've asked God, show us your will. Show us an answered prayer. Well, I will say this. I don't think it's wrong to ask God for signs with a humble, faith-seeking heart. We see many examples of this in the Bible. But what God dislikes is a proud heart. A heart that says, prove it, show me, prove yourself, or else. And this was the heart of the Pharisee. It wasn't a humble request. It was a standoff, putting Jesus to the test. And that's why he responded. So let's talk a little bit about signs and wonders. These miracles and signs, they are unexpected. And these things defy logic, and they fascinate us. And it's mind-boggling to consider events like, the crossing of the Red Sea or Jesus walking on water. For me, it raises questions of why. Why do we see so few signs today? Why did God offer so many more miracles back in the day, but not so much now? Well, first of all, back in the day, it was for authentication. Authentication. When we surveyed the Bible and we see that God had used miracles not to impress for the sake of impressing. No, he used them to authenticate. He used them to authenticate his messenger, and secondly, to authenticate his message. So people back then wanted to know that they weren't being misled. Fake news isn't a modern thing. So people need to know that the speaker was an authority and that he spoke with authority. And modern people, we're no different than our ancient counterparts. Like them, we want authentic, reliable information. But instead of being vetted by news editors or peer reviewers or theological schools, God had used miracles to vet his messenger and his message. So when Jesus performed his miracles, he authenticated himself as the Son of God. For example, after Jesus walked on water, do you remember how his disciples responded? They said, "Truly, you are the Son of God." They saw him do this, and it authenticated who he was. But there is a second important reason why Jesus does miracles, and it's to let us know that God's kingdom has come to the earth. Miracles of Jesus represents that God's kingdom has come to the earth. So when Jesus performed all these healings and demonstrated his power, it's to show that God's reign had started. It had arrived on the earth. God is right here, right now, and his kingdom is established and being established. And you and I, we are his citizens. So God's kingdom isn't this distant future place up in the clouds after we die. No, it's being established and it's continued being built by you and me. So when God came to earth 2,000 years ago, that's when his kingdom had begun. I like what Tim Keller says about miracles. This is what he says in his book. Jesus' miracles in particular were never magic tricks designed only to impress and to coerce. Instead, he used miraculous power to heal the sick, feed the hungry, and raise the dead. Why? We modern people think of miracles as the suspension of natural order, but Jesus meant them to be the restoration of the natural order. So, quite a new way to understand miracles. With Jesus as king, these signs and wonders, they're not the exception. No, miracles and wonders is the restoration of what he's trying to establish on the earth. Okay, so after Jesus rebukes the Pharisees for their stubbornness, he tells two stories. He tells two stories in response to them asking for a sign. And he reminds them of, first of all, the story of Jonah, and secondly, the story of the Queen of the South. So let's first of all look at the story of Jonah. What should they remember? Let's look at the scripture. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so for 3 days and 3 nights the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth. The people of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the proclamation of Jonah. And see, something greater than Jonah is here. So if you remember the story of Jonah, Jonah goes AWOL. Being a Jew, he had refused God's instruction to go and prophesy to the Gentiles in the city of Nineveh. So God responds by sending this massive fish, and it swallows him whole. And for 3 days and 3 nights, he was stuck in the belly of the fish. But on the third day, he was regurgitated and spit out, and Jonah repents. And then he goes to preach to the people in Nineveh. And the entire city, they repented and they convert. So with this story, Jesus presents 2 lessons to them. Lesson number 1. Jesus uses the sign of Jonah to teach them about his ultimate mission. Like Jonah, Jesus will be in darkness. He'll be in the belly of the earth for 3 days, and he will suffer the agony of hell. But God will raise him on the 3rd day so he can bring salvation to you and to me. So this was his mission. And there is a second lesson which was a harder one for the Pharisees to swallow. He tells them that the converts in Nineveh, those Gentiles, they were spiritually light years ahead of them. They saw the light and they repented after listening to Jonah. And these Gentiles will become judges of the Jewish people. Yep, the Gentiles judging God's chosen people. And you can imagine how this sounded to them. A pagan judging me? I'm God's chosen person. That's absurd. What do they know? Now, this was a tough pill for them to swallow, but Jesus was trying to point out their stubbornness. So Jesus continues with the second story, the story of the Queen of the South. The Queen of the South. It sounds so mysterious. So who is the Queen of the South? Well, when I Googled it, it brought me to this Netflix miniseries, The Queen of the South. And the synopsis: a powerful story of Teresa Mendoza. When her drug-dealing boyfriend is unexpectedly murdered in Mexico, Teresa seeks refuge in America. There, she plots to bring down the entire cartel so she can become the Queen of the South. Wow, it sounds dark and gritty. The scorned woman seeking power and revenge. Well, Hollywood had stolen this moniker from the Bible because the real Queen of the South refers to Queen Sheba. She was the Queen of Ethiopia referenced in 1 Kings. And this story tells of this legendary meeting between Queen Sheba and King Solomon. And Jesus refers to this fascinating interaction of these 2 powerhouses. Solomon, he's the king of Israel, a man of God with legendary wisdom. And Sheba, the outsider, the Gentile woman, she is also very powerful. She's an independent woman in her own right. And God was working in the situation because he was working in the heart of Sheba as he draws her towards Solomon. So let's look at this story in 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 1 all the way to 13. When the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon and his relationship to the Lord, she came to test Solomon with hard questions. Arriving at Jerusalem with a very great caravan with camels carrying spices, large quantities of gold and precious stones, she came to Solomon and talked with him about all that she had on her mind. Solomon answered all of her questions. Nothing was too hard for the king to explain to her. When the Queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon, the palace he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attending servants in their robes, his cupbearer and burnt offerings he made at the temple of the Lord, she was overwhelmed. She said to the king, "The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and wisdom is true. But I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told to me, in wisdom and in wealth you have far exceeded the report I heard. Verse 8, how happy your people must be. How happy your officials who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Praise be to the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and placed you at the throne of Israel. Because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, he has made you king to maintain justice and righteousness. So there it is. I'm sure it was a fascinating meeting between the two. And the Bible is really the main historical source of the life of Sheba. But again, Hollywood has taken liberties, as it does, and used legends to create this romantic, harlequin romance of a story between these two. And almost every search on the computer of Solomon and Sheba, it brings up results like this. Images of these lovebirds. I'm not sure. I don't really know if they had this kind of relationship. But mythology and legend has stories of marriage and romance. But again, these are legends. But what I see here is a story of God working in the heart of this queen. She did not know about God until he ignited that spark of faith in her heart. He allowed her to hear news about Solomon. And she heard that he was a king who honored his God and ruled with legendary wisdom. And once this curiosity was impressed in her heart, she took it and ran with it. She pursued her questions, wanting to meet this man face to face. And she had so many things to ask him. Questions about politics and faith, ponderings of life and death, and the mysteries of life. And she admitted she was skeptical at first. I'm sure her experience with these kinds of men didn't jive with the reports. She was probably thinking, is this even possible? I've met men like this, rich men. Men like this are all arrogant power mongers. How could it be that he's filled with the wisdom of his God? I must seek him out. And Sheba does just that. She feels that deep need to satisfy her questions and her curiosity and meet this man of God. So she goes. She decides to make this trip. And this was a thoughtful, calculated decision because this trip would take an enormous investment of resources and time. It would be 1,500 miles from somewhere South Arabia to Jerusalem, which would have taken weeks and weeks by caravan. And what drove her was faith and curiosity. Faith and curiosity drove her, but God would reward her. And when she finally arrived in Solomon's courts and saw the splendor, she was blown away. It says she was utterly overwhelmed. Sheba was a wealthy and powerful woman in her own right. And I'm sure she's seen rich. She's seen powerful. She's seen grandeur and ate the best. But what impressed her most was not the externals, but it was Solomon himself. It was the heart and mind of Solomon that took her by surprise. His witness of God's wisdom and insight just took her breath away. And she came to him with tough questions. She held nothing back. She unloaded her most perplexing, difficult topics and riddles. But Solomon received everything, all of her questions with grace, and he answered them with insight and respect. And after spending time with him and hearing his wisdom, I believe this encounter ignited that spark into this raging fire for God. Look at her response again in verse 9. Praise be to the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and placed you on the throne of Israel. A very humble response and praise to the king, acknowledging the power and the providence of God in Solomon's life. She saw it. And before she leaves, she feels deeply indebted to him and to God, and she reciprocates by honoring Solomon with many, many extravagant gifts. So this foreigner had come to Jerusalem with doubt and skepticism. but she returns home with a heart exploding with faith and joy in God. So now let's go back to Jesus and his lesson. This was the lesson that Jesus wanted to impress on the Pharisees. Jesus says to them, "The queen of the south will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because she comes from the ends of the earth to listen to the wisdom of Solomon." So Jesus is saying that by comparison to this woman, this Gentile woman, she puts you to shame. She is going ahead of you. She demanded nothing from Solomon. Instead, in humility, she left her own home at her own expense, went to seek out truth. And she had an open heart to listen and to learn from another about God. And by contrast, the Jews were blind. They just were blinded by their pride. They thought they were so good. And they said, "Prove it. Prove yourself to us. Show us a sign. Let us see what you're made of." Queen Sheba, she is an example and a legacy for us. After God had sparked that small faith in her heart, she responded to it. She pursued it. She represents the part of ourselves that always is seeking and striving for the things of God. We can see how she listened, she studied, she asked, she marveled, she spoke truth, and she encouraged others. And in the end, she felt that witness of God in Solomon, and she realized that there is so much more and mighty and expansive that more than she could ever have imagined. And she praised God for that, and she urged others to follow. So she again is an example to us. So as we seek God, we will experience something deeper that changes us. Don't take for granted your faith that it should be like this. God is so much more and has so much more for us as we model ourselves and follow after his Son. So don't let your hearts become proud. Don't seek for the shortcuts, the little fortune cookie type of faith. So let's not conclude that the lack of signs means that God doesn't care for us. He does. God deeply loves and cares for us, and he's with us at this very moment. So ask him for faith. Ask him to help you to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And this is my prayer. My prayer is that you will trust God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, constantly seeking him each and every day. Praise be to God.